So, hi, I'm Alec from the Ubiquitous Tavern server. It is designed to be a virtual mini-con, basically a place where role players, tabletop role players can meet every other Friday nights and for a few hours play one-shots. It allows people to try new systems, things that have been on their bucket list for forever, or for indie developers to come bring their games to playtest. And in fact, we have one of those indie developers from our community right now. It's Kevin Parsons, Parsons. I kind of choked off the S on that one. And you are creator of D20 Go. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
D20 Go was sort of a passion project when I fell out of the whole role-playing community for a couple of years, actually, maybe more like 5 or 6 years, just because it was so hard to schedule those play sessions, you know. My group got up to where it was like 6 to 8 hours. You know, we'll take every other Sunday and we'll spend 6 hours, and like that's a whole day. The day's gone, you know. And as life got busier and I got married and settled down, I've got a kid now. It's just hard to play, you know. It's hard to schedule those sessions. So I looked into play-by-post gaming, and it's awesome. There's such a huge community. You can log on to Mythweavers or Rollgate or anywhere. There's all these play-by-post communities, and you can just join open games without any background, you know, just jump right in. But none of the games are designed for play-by-post, you know. And this is no exaggeration. One of my first 5th edition games on a play-by-post server, it took us 3 days, 3 real-time days to walk across the street. And that's when I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. Combat, the consensus that I came across is the combat takes about a week. Mm-hmm. And by then, like, a lot of the players were like, what are we fighting for? Like, what was this battle again? And that's not good storytelling to me. You know, if the characters themselves can't remember where they were going, I think there's a problem there. So my goal was to create a system that would allow you to asynchronously do a play-by-post game without always slowing down constantly and things dragging out at, you know, absurdly long.
So how does it do that?
The main way is to reduce the back and forth between the players and the GM. Okay, roll initiative. Well, now Billy's got to roll initiative, and Sarah's got to roll initiative, and this one's going to roll initiative. And then it gets back to the GM. And if the GM's at work, then he won't get back till he gets off work, you know. And so that constant back and forth with every roll, every encounter, just it ends up slowing things down, unless people are just really, really diligent, and they aren't always that diligent. So the goal is just to reduce as much back and forth as possible, especially in combat. Combat's where it gets really slow. And in D20 Go, combat is handled with one roll. And there's a couple of systems that have done before. There was the one roll engine, I think it was called. Burning Wheel's basic combat system handles the entire conflict in one roll. But those systems, while they're great, the whole system isn't really designed for play-by-post. That was just one aspect of it. So other things we've done is like reduce the amount of stats you have to keep up with. There's no hit points in D20 Go. My character is injured or he's not injured. And there's toughness, and your characters do get tougher as they level up without having to be trapped, you know, well, I'm at 38 hit points and now I'm at 32 hit points. And just a lot of the number crunching is just gone without, I don't think we've sacrificed any depth.
Sure. Well, so for instance, if you're going into a combat and it's a single roll, rolls are generally pass-fail. How do you handle having like a more nuanced combat situation, like something that adds to the story rather than, yep, you killed the bad guys?
That's good. What I've tried to do is have a character, the classes have attributes of class features that can affect combat, affect the outcome. Like the rogue has the ability to take any trait that they've got, whether it's poison train or stealth or any trait they've got that has separates that character from the others. They can apply that trait into their first roll of combat. So if I'm a rogue, normally combat it's 3d20. I roll d20 3 times and I add in my combat attribute. But for the rogue, on his first roll, if he makes a point to sneak up on the bad guys and he's in position before that combat begins, he can add his stealth bonus to that first die to represent the backstab. The Vanguard, if he's able to position himself protecting his teammates, Vanguard's sort of a fighter class. If he can position himself between the enemy and his teammates to protect them, then he gains a bonus. So there are strategic advantages that characters can gain if they prepare for the combat. They think about it strategically. And then I think a lot of the drama of the combat is narrative anyways. I've been in a lot of D&D combats that are just, I roll, okay, he rolls, okay, I roll, and then they roll, and we just keep going around, and I attack it over and over. And you can be more dramatic with it. You can do more in the D&D system, just like you can do more narratively in D20 Go. It's if the players choose to, right?
Mm-hmm. So that means you prepare for combat. So you might say like, hey, before we go into combat, I'm going to try these different things. So does each player roll 3 times?
Yes.
Okay,
every player rolls 3 times.
So there are a lot of rolls, but then that allows all of the players simultaneously to do their whole rolls for the combat in that single round. And so in like a play-by-post terminology, right? Like you have the GM kicking off combat, and then everybody can do their rolls, and then the GM could just like get back to the the story right after everyone's done rolling and say, here's the result.
In that moment where the DM normally asks for initiative,
mm-hmm.
in D20 Go, the DM says, okay, we're starting combat, and let's go ahead and roll for combat. So instead of rolling initiative, you go ahead and roll for the entire fight. And part of my philosophy was that like there's no way you can have a die roll for every single action, micro action your character takes in combat. I mean, yeah, it's cool to roll for attack and then roll for damage, which I don't know why that's separate rolls anyways in a lot of games. Mm-hmm. But I'm attacking, I'm evading, I might be blocking. Even the DMG talks about how an attack roll represents a lot of things that's going on in your character's head. So I'm like, if it's already taking care of a lot of stuff, let's go ahead and consider the whole fight, mm-hmm. And those 3 rolls represent all of the ebb and flow of that combat scene, of that whole encounter. So the DM says, okay, we're starting combat, let's get our combat rolls. So everybody narrates or explains their strategy for that fight. If I'm playing the archer, I'm like, oh, well, I'm gonna try to stay out of this fight. I'm gonna get behind so and so, and maybe strafe to the side while I'm attacking. So and I'm focused on evasion, I'm going to roll skirmish. So he rolls 1d20 plus his skirmish 3 times, and then we count up how many successes the archer got. And then we do that for all the party members. So it's all essentially one round. The DM asks for a roll once, and then everybody rolls, and the DM can go ahead and start wrapping up combat immediately.
Nice. And so the wrapping up combat, it depends system to system, who narrates what actions. Is it very typically the DM who looks at all the rolls and says, this is how each of the players did? Are those rolls taken as a whole, or like do they represent 3 rounds of combat? I'm kind of curious about how that teases out.
That's really, it's just an abstraction. I like to think it was like a beginning, middle, and the end. Mm-hmm. The first die is how my character launched into the battle, and then the middle die is how he's holding it out, and that third die represents the end of it. You can look at it as sort of like an attack and a defense and a wild card. It's just really just an abstraction. Mm-hmm. I like for the players to narrate what happens. Sometimes that gets slow in play-by-post. So sometimes, depending on the group, and I always try to make sure the players feel like they have agency. But sometimes the GM will, or if I'm GM, I'll just wrap it up myself, and write a little paragraph narrating what's happened, based on all the descriptions that the players have given me for their strategies. But I really prefer for the players to, all right, you killed, there were 4 orcs, you killed all 4 of them, Billy rolled really well. Billy, why don't you start us off and tell us what happened? And then let the players go around and say what their characters did. Because I think it's, if you roll a 20, you want to be the one to describe that crit, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the players like to be able to describe their fight scenes. And my favorite is the players get to describe their injuries. And they get so creative with describing their injuries. You roll a natural 1 in a D20 Go combat, that's a major injury. So the GM will roll on a chart and say, hey, man, you've got a major injury to your right arm. So why don't you add that into your narration? And the guy goes, okay. And then they get so crazy with this really dramatic description of how he got his right arm broken. And I'm like, okay, that was cool, but no, you said it, so now you've got a broken right arm. So let's keep that and make a note of that on your sheet. And it's the opportunity to get dramatic with it.
I think that is missing in some systems or some games, or how people play a certain part of them. So, I mean, if you take Dungeons and Dragons, for example, there really isn't the concept of like disadvantages or quirks per se. I think they try and do a little bit of in later editions, like role playing by creating more background stuff. And I think one of those things is you can like list a flaw for like role playing purposes. But the ability for players to take ownerships of the bad things that happen to them, either by like creating some kind of disadvantage that will actually be a handicap during play. And that's usually see that in like point systems, for example, where, you know, you can kind of reward them for taking a mechanical disadvantage by getting extra points to make their character. But, you know, another way of doing that is letting people take ownership of their injuries or the bad things that happen to people. There's a clip I love, and I think I've shared it in the channel, from Tabletop, where they're playing Fate, and the you know, the way they're running that is just so great, because the good things and the bad things you know, are, I mean, sometimes the GM will propose something, but a lot of times he says like, hey, all right, something stops you in your tracks, what is it, or something like that. And it is, at least in terms of like running quick one-shots or short things, like being able to like turn that over to a player and say like, what do you got, is a great way to like involve people in, you know, get the players more involved in a short period of time that otherwise just could be the GM talking a lot. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, injuries. Like, I've got a kind of a question of like injuries. So for the system, are they just like usually physical, or like could someone be like psychologically injured by a non-combat situation?
That's not in the core rules. I've been toying with the idea of doing a sort of a horror Call of Cthulhu variant of D20 Go. I've already made I've got a sci-fi variant, which we did a play test and it was a lot of fun. I've got a post-apocalyptic variant, and I feel like horror is missing. And I've been toying with the idea of how to do psychological trauma. But I feel like I need to play Call of Cthulhu first before I even mess with that genre. You know, I don't feel like I even have a right to build that system until about at least play Call of Cthulhu once and
play Call of Cthulhu, Dread. Actually, but Dread is one thing I don't think you could play very well in a Discord server, right? Because it has the whole Jenga tower ideal.
That game. Oh my god, yeah.
That game, yeah. I'm like, oh, like I love the idea of the server like being a place where people can like try items from their bucket list. But I'm like, yeah, there's a few games that I can see just don't translate.
Yeah, I saw a conversation of some people they were legitimately trying to figure out how to make it work, and I'm like, just find a different system, cuts. It's tricky. Everyone's gonna have their own Jenga tower.
Yeah, that's great. So one thing with the D20 Go, I mean, I know from the title and how you describe the rolls, right? It's a 20-sided die, and that does it only use a 20-sided die?
Yeah, just the D20. That's it.
Okay, so like what systems did you look at when you designed the system? Like any inspirations?
I really started with 3.5 as sort of like a baseline, because that's the system that I know the best. And I think that like I know there are a lot of role players that really are tired of hearing about D&D, but it's the big daddy of all of it. You know, it's such an icon. That's why I went with the D20 itself, because that die itself is iconic of, you know, role playing games in general. And it's, you know, it's essentially a pared down percentile die, so it can do anything, right?
Yeah. Yep. Well, yeah, it has quite a few degrees of freedom, right? So you can have a lot of variations. There's, I mean, it's interesting. We often use it as, you know, go or no go. But you could use some kind of scaled system easily with it, kind of similar to, you know, the apocalypse world style stuff, where you have like a fail state, a complicated state, and then like a win state. Yeah. So it is a great engine, and it is kind of iconically RPG.
Yeah, it's just that everyone knows that he's got a D20. He plays role playing games, and I didn't like, it's almost like an homage to that die, that icon. Like, you can't lose that.
Yeah, I've designed a system without it, but you know, there are times when I feel that twinge of like, oh, using only 6-sided dice. That's so pedestrian.
Of course, the same thing happens to me. Sometimes I'm playing D20 Go and I'm like, I want to grab the rest of my dice, and I just want to roll this D12 for something.
Yeah, I know. D4 is funky looking dice with 3 numbers on each face and all that joy. There's a part of that, you know, and that's kind of one of the things I like about having a server or a place where people come to play a bunch of different systems, is like you get to try, you know, those different mechanics, and you can try very streamlined, very narrative things. I think somebody was talking about potentially, they haven't scheduled anything for this Friday, or it's next Friday coming up, but but like playing Fiasco or something like that, you know, versus, you know, some people who are, you know, looking more like who are requesting specific dice spots to run their, you know, D&D
Yeah,
adventure.
I saw that. Yeah, that's cool.
And so, yeah, it's fun to have those. And yeah, so I mean, you kind of talked about like the dice and the feel of rolling different dice, but what is it for you that makes a really good like tabletop RPG game session?
For me, it's all about it's just got to be a good story. You know, it's not about a character showing off. It's not about the fight scenes. It's about the character development. You know, I want to this I want to go back to my roots and where it all got started. It's Dragonlance. You know, that's what I want. I want every campaign to ultimately. I don't care what setting it is. I want to ultimately feel like Dragonlance. You know, I've got characters of varying ages and experiences coming together, and like there's some real conflict, inner conflict and drama within their group, but then they ultimately come together to fight, you know, off some, you know, apocalyptic scenario. It's just such a beautiful story. Like if you didn't cry when Flint dies, then you're not even human, you know. And and there's so many emotions that and reactions that people have to that story. Like I've seen people on servers about how much because of that book, and like just because of that character Tasselhoff, I guess. And then there's some people that just love them, and I love that people have such strong reactions to it. And that's what a role-playing game should result in: great storytelling. I don't care if your character's a badass or not. Like that shouldn't even be in your mind. It should be about the story that your character gets to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate to the excitement of leveling up your character. There's just, you know, that ticks a box for me as much as like I would intellectually say I'm 100% in your camp. There's a part of me like, okay, honestly, like there's something about leveling up and getting to assign points that I geek out on. But I agree with you very strongly, like story, and it sounds like the way you talk about story is also very much driven by the players and how they interact with each other, you know, as much of, or possibly even more in some respects, than how they interact with the setting. Like you didn't really talk about like world building or setting, which can play into that. But it, you know, sounds like you really focus on the relationship between the player characters.
Yeah, I think that's where story comes from. You know, stories come from drama, right? From relationships.
Yeah. So, do you have a favorite character that you personally have played with or GM'd?
Yeah, he was a rogue slash sorcerer that I played for a couple of years. That he wanted to be good. He really wanted to be good, but the darkness was always pulling at him. And the DM thought it was always thought it was funny to screw with me and put me into more stickier and stickier moral situations. And my character, he always ultimately did what he had to do to get the job done. And it tore at him, you know, it really tore at him. And he was scarred. And when we had ups and downs in the campaign, there was a point where he had joined some guild, kind of like a, you know, Harper's or something, one of those like NPC guild things that was trying to bring him out of the darkness. But then, you know, things started going downhill again, and you know, that the darkness is where he found power. And it was cool to watch his up and down and everything.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like so you have the character's internal struggle, but also you know, sounds like there was a DM that kind of turned that into a theme and really let you maximize that, like played into that.
Jerk. He was a real jerk about it.
I've been there too. I remember listening to a podcast, Friends at the Table or something like that, where I feel like at least I liked the story, but it also felt like they kind of pushed one of the characters into choosing a evil alignment on the technicality. And then every time there's an opportunity to be evil, we're like kind of pushing her like, hey, why don't you do the evil thing here?
Yeah, that was the situation I was in, yeah.
Yeah, it made for great storytelling. It can be kind of brutal, but I'd be lying if I said I never did that as a GM. My wife and I played a little bit in school, and we found another couple that was playing with us, and we had fun. But you know, I kind of realized early on as a new player, she had a tendency to she wanted to unlock every mystery. And so I would let her do that, but they would get her into like binds and morally difficult situations until like, you know, that story progressed. to the point where actually the final climactic moment is the point at which she could confront the bad guy, or she could just close the door and walk away. And like, you know, that was kind of fun to set that up versus like, you know, every D&D game, you know, normally this was World of Darkness, different system, but like most D&D games, it's all about the big final battle and then, you know, some epilogue after that. But that was kind of fun to have a player shut the door on the final battle, and because of the way the story worked, and the character's own struggles and realizations, like it felt actually more satisfying than just like duking it out with some bad guy would have. And so it's kind of fun to
you just throw all that prep away, I guess, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to have something prepped, but at least this is one thing. I don't actually DM Dungeons and Dragons. Because like calculating the challenge ratings and things like that, I'm like, oh, that's just a lot of work. I haven't, you know, maybe someday I played it a few times, but someday when I work up to that, you know, I'll try that out. I've done like a few things here or there, like very lightly for like nephews or something like that, but not generally. And so it's like one area where it's like, yeah, I'll take a D20 Go system where you can, you know, be able to on the fly create an obstacle that resonates with the characters more than feeling like I have to go through like charts and tables and you know, and if the characters take a left or versus a right, then all my work goes to waste.
Yeah, I can see that being very, very stressful. One of my first DMing, this is back when I was a teenager and my group first got into it, and the DMing stick passed to me, and I had to run. It was one of my first or second games, and I threw, I think it was some cockatrices at them, you know, that can petrify and everything, and it looked to me like it was supposed to be an appropriate challenge rating, and I got my first TPK, and they were so mad at me. I mean, like it was like I was the worst DM ever. I'm like, geez, I'm new here, you know. It looked like you were supposed to be able to do it, you know. You could have ran, none of you ran, so they didn't let me GM for years after that. They were so mad. I'm like, let it go, guys.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks a lot to how attached people get to their characters. But there is also the expectation that every encounter you get into should be winnable. Because by default, you know, that's what we tend to do. But it is kind of fun. You have to have the right players with the right expectations, but it is kind of fun to be able to throw them. It's like, I don't know if you ever played any of those old MUDs that were like just text-based RPGs or whatever, where like they don't warn you when you're wandering into a high-level area. You just die really fast.
Yeah. At least you get to resurrect automatically with those games usually, right?
Yeah. So
D20 Go is when you establish those combat, essentially the encounter difficulty level, it's kind of open-ended. There's a sample bestiary, but you're welcome to make stuff up. You know, there's a simple guide for what an appropriate difficulty class is for each like party level. So you can just make something up and just say that's a difficulty class of 15, whatever. But when you establish an encounter, the GM has to decide what it means to win. You know, like if my low-level group accidentally encounters a frost giant, we're about to roll for combat for one thing. We're going to roll for this encounter, but I want you to understand, you know, that you guys, even if you win, all that means is escaping alive with all of your gear and everything. So you can be a little bit more flexible with what success means when you're rolling encounters in D20 Go.
Well, and a sense I had from just reading one of those sample one-shots you shared with me was that, you know, players also play a role in determining that by like saying how they start the combat or how they prepare for it or what they do before the combat. You know, I was seeing like a feature of the system, you know, that was interesting, which is like, hey, this combat is 16, but if they've prepared, you know, for example, with this, it might be lowered to a 14 or something. And so that allows you to like, fine, you want to kill the frost giants, maybe on a natural 20.
I need all 20s though. All 20s. That's what we're aiming for. Go ahead and throw a slaughter roll. A slaughter means you're like full on offense, no retreat. And let's see if you can pull it off, you know.
Nice.
That's fun.
Well, so if you were giving advice to somebody who is running the system for the first time, D20 Go, what advice would you give them?
Is this GMing advice or
GMing?
Advice?
Let's say GMing.
Oh man, for GMing advice, I don't know. I'm not even sure if I'm the right person to give GMing advice. have a conflict existing in the setting, you know, have
Mhm.
a world, and it doesn't have to be a crazy overdeveloped world, but have some kind of conflict that's already existing. You don't necessarily have to have your big bad enemy prepared because they're not going to be facing them right off anyways. But have some kind of tension in your world, whether it's a guild, like a thieves guild or something that's rampant in the city, or a political conflict, somewhere that drama can come from in the setting. Um, and the rest of the stuff you can wing it from then on out, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. I love I mean, I think one of the dangerous things that I think new GMs definitely can run into is the kind of like, all right, you're in a tavern, where do you go from here, right?
Yeah,
You have
yeah,
to like find the conflict. Whereas certainly if you like start with the conflict, and especially if you share that while people are creating characters, they can start weaving it into their backstory and like actually, you know, start with that running. Versus I know some of my early GMing experience where I'm like, all right, you guys are all together hanging out. What do you do? Or you're different people and you don't even know each other and I have to try and like wrangle them. Versus if you have a conflict, they can rally around and that streamlines it a whole lot.
yeah. I hate the starting as strangers concept, but sometimes it's hard to get players on the same board, especially if you're playing with strangers. Like sometimes they come to the table with a certain character in mind that doesn't have anything to do with your setting or the other
Mm-hmm.
characters that exist, and you're like, okay, here's the overarching goal. Let's hope you get to it at some point. And there's a lot of buy-in that has to happen from the players. You know,
Yep.
you can be a great GM or a terrible GM if your players are invested and are willing to work together. Then the story will probably work out fine. I know I've seen a lot of people that have talked about watching all these YouTube podcasts, YouTube videos, and podcasts and everything, and doing all this homework to be a GM. And I'm like, dude, just run one and learn from it. You know, I could spend 300 hours learning from podcasts, or I could spend one afternoon playing with my friends and figure it out. You know.
Yeah, and you know, friends are generally forgiving. So you
Yep.
let them know there
Yes, they
might be an
are.
accidental TPK and they'll be ready
Yeah.
for it.
Just don't kill everybody. Give them a
Yeah.
chance to run away.
Yeah, and that is something I do more and more. Just to your beginning of that comment, as a DM, is kind of set some parameters. Like, hey, I'm looking for characters who are going to do this, and
Yeah.
so one of the things you're going to answer with your backstory is why you're doing this,
Mhm.
rather than like letting them write whatever random backstory and being like, hey, there's this opportunity in front of you, and watch them like each character go a completely different direction with that. Um,
Yeah. The
like
backstory
that.
players they're always interesting to me. Still tell these great backstories, and I'm like,
Mhm.
but that backstory should have been the campaign. Like, forget the backstory. Let's make the story.
Yeah.
But some people are just really into that. You know.
Hmm. I don't know. It's like Dragon Age or Fantasy Age. I forget which. But I remember flipping through that book, and it's actually still one of the items on my bucket list that I'll either run or play sometime. But I haven't yet. But I remember they have a very Shire-like first adventure, which is like the main characters go out on an island for like some celebration, like coming of age celebration or something like that. But it happens to be haunted, and you know the stars align such that the ghosts come out, and then they have to deal with that. But I felt kind of enchanted by the fact that you know they didn't necessarily start out because in Dungeons and Dragons there is kind of the assumption you don't have to play it this way, but like the character classes are constructed, even though they're a little fragile at first, they're constructed as though you are a larger than life character. So like a level
Yeah.
one fighter is more powerful than most of your city guard, you know, generally speaking. And people play it differently. Like I think a
Yeah.
lot of times people like start giving classes to city guards and stuff like that, because they kind of tweak with that. But coming from that area of like, hey, you definitely should come with like desires and flaws and foibles, but you don't necessarily need to start your campaign, you know, punching giants in the face, you know, type of character. It's a different play style, and I think genre has a little bit to do with that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the growth of anime has brought in a lot of new players that have
Mm-hmm.
a different approach to role playing games.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us that got started in the '80s, and that whole OSR movement, they're more interested in the low power games, and then we've got these
Mm-hmm.
anime players that they want these characters to be so amazing. I had a character starting off level 1, and when he was introducing himself to the other characters and giving his backstory, he was talking about how he had been an assassin for the king for 20 years. And I'm like, why are you still level 1?
Yep.
This is embarrassing, you know? And in that same game, somebody else was talking about having been a veteran of like 2 or 3 wars. And I'm, you're level 1. Like, and I guess we hadn't had that conversation about getting on the same page, you know, before.
Well, and that's something where you can play with the rules of the game. And so if, you know, for example, start like, all right, wait, if that's what you guys are expecting, let's start at level 12 and run a level 12 game or something like that. But yeah, that type of thing, like, I think one of the biggest setups, again, to figure out is getting on page quickly or before a game. And I think a lot of, or some systems build in a step for that, at least to some degree. So like Fates, I think, basically has you kind of play out a very quick version of some scenes. So like someone will tee up a challenge and, or like some kind of challenge their character faced, and then they'll actually hand it over to the next character who will then say how they interacted with that challenge, either complicating it further or helping out or something. And you kind of, you know, do a round robin or something, so you weave your backstories together. But yeah, so I think there's a couple of things from what we've talked about that'll be helpful for GMs running campaigns. Is one, you know, get on the same page about what the conflicts are and how your character interacts with those, but also like the level, right?
Yeah.
You know, are you the street level superhero in a superhero campaign, or are you Superman, right? Those are 2 very different games.
Yeah. And I think the moral direction of the campaign needs to be sorted out in advance too. You know,
that's a good point.
I'm running a game right now where the campaign we agreed on. I threw out a few ideas, and the group agreed on. All of them are like way in debt to some criminal overlord. So they're going to be they're employed by this criminal overlord for at least the first 7 or 8 levels of the game before they are in position to start turning against her and everything. And the first situation I threw them in, they just had to rob a gambling hall. And one of the characters was like, "Oh, I'm not playing a thief." And I'm like, which game do you think you're playing? I thought we agreed on this.
Yeah.
He was cool with it. He was just role playing, but it made me nervous because I have seen people get like, and send me private messages. Hey man, I didn't really want to get into that situation. I'm like, oh God, I'm sorry. You know, let's figure out how to backtrack and work our way out of it and make this part of the story. Because people can get upset about certain situations, and you've got to, as a GM, you've got to be aware of that and sensitive of that. You know, you've got to listen to your players. You know.
I think that is something huge and something I just want to like underline as I'm producing videos for Ubiquitous Tavern and knowing that like eventually, you know, it didn't happen the first night. Things were very great. I'm expecting great things the second night, but like eventually someone's gonna, you know, come to me and say like, wow, that game had something in it that made me uncomfortable. But I love how you underlined the listening and that you can backtrack sometimes.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's a couple techniques there that I learned going to some conventions in California, like the Big Bad Con, where they have a list of like techniques you can use if you run specifically into that moral element, you know, from, you know, just calling a cut, you know, in time and hopefully creating, you know, the environment where players feel safe cutting. Right. And just saying like, hey, wait, okay, this is a little crazy. You know, and either asking like, all right, can that just happen off camera, or revising it, you know, more completely.
I like the lines and bills system.
Yeah, where these are things I don't want at all. And these are things that are okay, yeah, sure, they're gonna happen, but they're gonna happen off camera. We don't need to like graphic detail on those things. Yeah, those are very helpful, especially when you're getting together with a new group, right? Like when you've played with the same group for a while, you kind of have those expectations. But if you're like, you know, joining a con, a play-by-post where people are coming in and out, it's a little bit trickier, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you a very self-serving question, which is, what attracted you to the Ubiquitous Tavern server?
I think it's a genius idea, you know, with what's going on right now. Conventions I'm not going to a convention where there's, you know, 1,000 people wandering around, breathing on each other. You know, even with masks. Actually, I got my second dose, so I'm should be immune in a couple weeks now.
Nice.
But it's still like this past year, if anything, it has told us that there's an opportunity for virtual meetups. And in getting into the whole play by post posting, I've met a lot of people that just with social anxiety issues, which I have also, are afraid. They are afraid to go to conventions. They have trouble, meeting groups. They're intimidated by just showing up at a local game store and jumping into Adventures League or something. And so play by post and what you're doing gives those people an opportunity, an access point that I think is here's a self plug right here. I think
please.
You're offering something that was needed in the community, just the way I think D20 Go offers something that was needed in the community.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And yeah, I can second that. I like being around people. I'm kind of an ambivert. I like being around people, but especially when there are big groups, I don't know what to do with myself. There's way too much stimulation and information going on there. Like when I get to a table, I'm like extremely comfortable, but I'm like, oh, what do I do with myself in between sessions? It is a little overwhelming. I miss them. I hope they start up sometime, but I also hope that this can kind of be on a small scale, like easier way for people to get their adventuring fix, meet other people, hopefully in a place that doesn't feel as physically overwhelming, as a convention can, or going to, a store you've never been to before.
Yeah. And that I think a lot of the conventions are filled with people that are already experienced role players.
Yeah.
That are really just wanting more exposure to different products and everything, and the virtual avenue allows new players to come in too. I don't think a totally new role player is going to show up to a Dragon Con.
No.
The game that I'm running Tuesday,
right.
A woman messaged me and she's never played any role-playing game before at all. She's like, is that gonna be a problem? Like, no, come on down. I'm winging it. You can wing it, and we'll see what happens, and we'll just have fun. And I think it's cool. It's cool to any avenue we have to bring new players into this community. I think it's great.
Yeah, and that is something I love about it. And generally, my experience has been, and what I want to replicate here is that people are really excited for new players. Fresh blood, and again, there's so many people who are really creative, who I think thrive potentially in going to in a role-playing environment where they get to be a storyteller and an actor, and however they want to get into that. Is pretty fantastic. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It was intimidating for me to go to my first con. I was like, all right, I've got a system. I really want to play test it, and I don't know where to find other people. So I'm going to go to a convention. And after that, I was able to go with a little bit lower stress, but definitely new people are welcome. So thank you very much for my time. Anything you want to plug?
Play D20 Go, check it out on drive-thru-RPG. Look us up on Facebook.
Link in the description. So there'll be a link for D20 Go in the description. It's on drive-thru-RPG. And also there'll be a link to the Ubiquitous Tavern server where you can join us every other Friday night for pick up tabletop RPG games. New players welcome.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex.
Bye.